All right, good evening and welcome to a special live show tonight. Tonight is, of course, April 4th, 2023, or as our children and grandchildren will learn in school in the coming years, the date on which an American president was arrested for the very first time. Now, today's been a busy day. My team and I have been all over the city. We were at a campaign rally, rather a pro-Trump rally down in downtown Manhattan. Some of our team were actually inside of the courtroom. Some of our team is currently right now in Mar-a-Lago. Others were in Washington, D.C. Others were calling up lawyers and different legal analysts, different political analysts, kind of getting a holistic view on what this means for this moment and the moments moving forward into the next election cycle and into the next decade. And so let's begin by giving you sort of a brief background on what's happening in case you haven't been following along, because I know when I first heard about the Manhattan DA seriously considering these charges, when I heard that there was a serious possibility that Trump might be indicted, I had to go back and get a complete refresher on what this whole case was about, because even when it was happening, even when this whole Michael Cohen saga was taking place back in 2018, I always thought it was a bit of a distraction from the real issues that were happening at the time, things like the southern border, the issues with Iran, with North Korea. And so I did research back then, but I almost completely forgot about it. And so in preparation for today's video, we put together a short, about 6-minute long timeline of events that sort of goes step by step from 2006 leading up to today, leading up to the day that President Trump got arrested. So without further ado, let me play you that video, and then we'll get into what was revealed by Alvin Bragg and his team earlier today in court. And so let me play you that timeline. If you are like most people, then very likely you have completely forgotten all the details about this whole Michael Cohen, Stormy Daniels, hush money payment story. I know that for me, when the Manhattan DA began to float the idea of arresting Trump, I had to go back and refresh my memory about what this whole affair was even all about. And so let me give you a brief timeline of events in order to jog your memory regarding what these criminal charges against Trump are really all about. Let's start all the way back in the year 2006. While Donald Trump was already married to Miss Melania, a woman named Stephanie Clifford, who goes by the stage name Stormy Daniels, she claimed that her and Trump had an affair. Now, whether this really happened or not, well, that's quite frankly anyone's guess. But that's the allegation, at least, that in 2006, Donald Trump had an affair with Miss Stephanie Clifford somewhere in a hotel room in Lake Tahoe. Then, around that same time period, from 2006 to 2007, another woman named Karen McDougal, who was a former Playboy playmate, she claimed that her and Donald Trump also had an affair. Again, whether this is true or not is anyone's guess. For his part, it's worth mentioning that President Trump denies that either of these two affairs took place. But regardless, that's what the women are claiming. However, at this point, in 2006 and 2007, these alleged affairs are not publicly known about. This is just when the women alleged they took place. Then we fast forward the clock to the year 2011. That was when a magazine called In Touch Weekly interviewed Miss Stephanie Clifford about her alleged affair with Donald Trump. However, after conducting the interview, In Touch Weekly wound up not publishing the article because at that time, Donald Trump's lawyer, Mr. Michael Cohen, he threatened to sue the magazine if they did. He threatened to sue them if they published the story, and so they wound up killing it instead. Then we fast forward again to the year 2016. The presidential election is in high gear. Trump is, of course, the Republican nominee running against Hillary Clinton, and it was at this time that both of these women came back to the forefront. In August of 2016, Ms. Karen McDougal, she sold the rights to her story about this alleged affair to the National Enquirer for a cool $150,000. However, the National Enquirer, they never published the story. That's because this $150,000 payment, it was what we call in the industry a catch and kill agreement. It's where a media outlet buys the rights to a story in order to bury it and prevent it from ever being published, to prevent it from ever seeing the light of day. A later investigation actually found that Donald Trump's lawyer, Mr. Michael Cohen, was coordinating with the National Enquirer in order to bury the story. Regardless, a few months later, still in 2016, Ms. Stephanie Clifford, who is the other woman, she also came out and she began to threaten to bring her story to the public. And this was happening, by the way, right around October, which happens to be just a month from Election Day. And at that time, Mr. Michael Cohen, he arranged a $130,000 payment to Ms. Clifford in exchange for her signing a non-disclosure agreement regarding this whole sordid affair. She took the money and she signed the agreement. Now, what happens next gets a little bit tricky, and what the facts are sort of depends on who you believe. Because this story, about these two women, was buried for about 2 years. But then, in 2018, the Wall Street Journal broke the story and told the whole world for the first time about these hush money payment affairs. However, when the story first broke, Mr. Michael Cohen claimed that he paid these women himself for money that came out of his own pocket. But eventually he reversed himself, and he told the court that he made these payments at the direct behest of President Trump, and that furthermore, he was actually reimbursed by the Trump organization through what he referred to as routine legal expenses. What Michael Cohen essentially claimed here is that President Trump was reimbursing him for these hush money payments through a series of $35,000 checks. And the way that these checks were at least allegedly sent is that Michael Cohen, he would send in monthly invoices to Trump's company for a quote-unquote retainer fee, and the Trump organization would, in turn, send them checks and account for this payment on their books as a quote-unquote legal expense. Michael Cohen was eventually sentenced to several years of prison for tax evasion, bank fraud, and campaign finance violations. However, despite the fact that Michael Cohen admitted to making these payments at the behest of President Trump in order to, as he claims, influence the outcome of the election, President Trump himself has maintained his innocence. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, President Trump released this letter here on social media. It was a letter that was written by Michael Cohen's lawyer, and it was sent to the Federal Elections Commission on February 8th of 2018. And here's what the letter said in relevant part, quote, "In a private transaction in 2016, before the U.S. presidential election, Mr. Cohen used his own personal funds to facilitate a payment of $130,000 to Ms. Stephanie Clifford. Neither the Trump organization nor the Trump campaign was a party to the transaction with Ms. Clifford, and neither reimbursed Mr. Cohen for the payment directly or indirectly." Meaning that Mr. Michael Cohen's lawyer was essentially telling the Federal Elections Commission that neither Trump nor his organization had anything to do with these payments, although of course later Mr. Michael Cohen did change his story and plead guilty. Regardless, though, it is the case that in 2021, the Federal Elections Commission, they wound up dropping the case themselves. Specifically, the Federal Elections Commission, who was interested in whether or not these hush money payments constituted campaign finance violations, they decided to drop their case against President Trump in the year 2021. And at that point, pretty much everyone assumed that the case was closed. A couple of times it came back into the news cycle, but each time it did, the Manhattan District Attorney, who was at first Mr. Cyrus Vance and then later Mr. Alvin Bragg, they both said that there was not enough evidence for an indictment. However, despite these earlier assertions, and despite the fact that the case was dropped at the federal level, just earlier this year, the new Manhattan District Attorney, Mr. Alvin Bragg, he revived the case, he assembled a grand jury, and he has now indicted President Trump. And so that brings us perfectly back to the present day, wherein President Trump is in court, getting arraigned, and hearing the charges that have been filed against him. And moving forward, the two questions which will likely need to be answered will be, for one, whether there was indeed bookkeeping fraud on the part of the Trump organization, and that secondly, whether or not that alleged bookkeeping fraud was done in service of hiding campaign finance violations. We'll just have to see how this case plays out over the coming days. Video I pre-recorded yesterday, kind of as a primer to anyone who's not been paying attention about what's been happening. But now we actually have the unsealed indictment in hand. And right before we dive into this, I actually wanted to bring up something that happened a few days ago because it has gotten almost no attention from the media, but it's quite a big deal. And I almost laughed when I found out about it. When Trump was first indicted, when that news broke and that he was indicted, his lawyers came out and confirmed it. Within quite literally minutes of that happening, over in Florida, there was a bill that was introduced into the Florida Senate that would pave the way for Governor DeSantis to be able to run for office. Because down in Florida, they have a law in the books saying that if the governor of Florida runs for office, runs for president, let's say, then he has to relinquish his current position. So basically, if Governor DeSantis decides to run for president, he files the paperwork to run in the national election for president, he would have to relinquish his governorship. He would have to relinquish his governorship and have, I guess, the assistant governor step in. But just literally minutes, as everyone's attention was laser focused on the indictment, in the Florida Senate, a bill was introduced to amend that law and allow him to run for president without giving up his role as governor. So I just thought that was interesting, and it completely went under the radar. So before we dive into this indictment, I wanted to mention that just in case you maybe either weren't paying attention or are paying attention and that just slipped by. Now, in terms of the arraignment, I think in the timeline, it was broken down fairly well. By me, I mean patting myself on the back. But after, let's say, 2016, and after that Wall Street Journal article came out, there really began to be these two competing narratives about what happened with these payments, who was authorizing them, whether they were being reimbursed or not. Now, there is a lot of evidence saying that they were being reimbursed by the Trump organization for the lawyer, and there was a kind of another side story with Ms. Karen McDougal in the National Enquirer, how that organization was helping Trump to get elected by kind of catching these stories and killing them. But setting that aside, what this indictment shows is something I've never seen before in covering these types of indictments and lawsuits. And that's why the name of today's episode is A Crime Without a Name. Because in this indictment, basically, if you're wondering why it's 34 counts of felonies, if you're looking at the number of felonies and wondering how can there be so many, what did he possibly do? Basically, what the Manhattan DA did was that they took every alleged check that Trump wrote to Michael Cohen as a reimbursement for Miss Stormy Daniels, that hush money payment, and they treated each individual check as a separate crime. And so when you're going through this indictment paperwork, it's like 8th count, 9th count, 10th count, and every count, the only parts that are different are the date and the check number, but everything else is the exact same. The penal code that they claim is broken is the exact same. It's just check after check. They're basically treating each individual payment from the Trump organization or from Trump to Michael Cohen as an individual crime. But the reason that I named today's episode A Crime Without a Name is because of this fact. Here is how, again, each individual indictment, here's what it says, quote, "The defendant," meaning President Trump, "with intent to commit another crime and aid and conceal the commission thereof, made false and caused a false entry in the business records of an enterprise," end quote. And so what that essentially means, and this is a very key point for this lawsuit, in order for this to be a felony, in order for this to be a Class E felony bookkeeping fraud, basically, you need to have bookkeeping fraud that's committed in order to hide another crime. So you're hiding another crime with bookkeeping fraud, and that's why it's a felony. And you need to prove that both of these are the case in order for it to be a felony bookkeeping fraud. But the reason it's a crime without a name is because every one of these indictments just says the same thing, that the defendant, meaning Trump, he intended to conceal another crime by committing false entries in his business records. Again, he intended to hide another crime. He intended to hide another crime. He intended to hide another crime. But nowhere do they mention what that other crime is. And so I wanted to actually introduce one of our reporters here at the Epoch Times. He was in the courtroom as Trump was getting arraigned, as he was pleading not guilty to the charges. And he can give us a bit more insight into how those proceedings, play themselves out, as well as what these charges mean and how they will have to be proved in court. So Gary, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Roman.
So to start with, can you sort of set the stage for the audience? How hard was it to get into that courtroom today?
So, I mean, I think the really special thing about today was that none of us knew what. Personally, I was there at 2:40 p.m. this morning, wearing exactly this. There was a line specifically dedicated for press. There were people camping there with, different heaters. They have like people setting up tents. And finally, at around morning time, we were actually arranged by this court official, and we were given a press pass to, and told we were going to be coming back at lunch. So it was quite a mission, to long story short. And I'm glad that I became one of the people who were actually able to get into one of the they call them the spillover rooms for the media, where you can sit in and listen to the proceeding.
You definitely were there for a historic event. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, school kids will be learning that it'll be on tests. It'll be what was the date of the first president in American history to be arrested, and it'll be today, April 4th, 2023. So give us your take on President Trump's demeanor. How was he in the courtroom?
Well, he didn't speak much. From what I recall, it was only a few words. He said not guilty. Obviously, that's your response to the guilty plea. He answered 2 yes or no questions, and that's pretty much it. he seems pretty he seems like I had a conversation with Joseph Tacopina, it's one of his lead lawyers, and using his lawyer's words, or that his knees don't buckle. So he seems he's holding his ground, and he kind of waved to the media when he walked into the court, and he was sort of accompanied by obviously a lot of Secret Service, a lot of lawyers. Personally, I didn't really have a chance to interact with him that much, but he did seem pretty very tough, let's say. Yeah.
Gary, I wanted to get your take on this specific crime, this alleged crime that President Trump is being accused of. As I mentioned before you came on, again, it mentions in the indictment papers again and again that he committed bookkeeping fraud in order to hide another crime. Now, that crime is not laid out here in the courtroom. Was it made clear what specific crime he's being alleged of hiding with bookkeeping fraud?
It wasn't. And that was the confusing part, and because during the proceeding, actually, the couple of reporters I were talking about this, it was like, what was the hook that they elevated that misdemeanor? Normally, what's a misdemeanor to a felony? And I'm sure you went over this in your program already, but the normally a falsification of business record, that's a misdemeanor, right? And that's according to New York Penal Law 175/05, I believe. So if you want to change that to a felony, you need to, so to say, find that the falsification of business record was to conceal or commit another crime, right? And that's exactly what you're referring to. It's the other crime. It's like, what's the other crime that the former president has committed or he's trying to conceal? In that indictment, it said intent to conceal or commit. So they have to prove intent. And from what I hear in the courthouse, and this is me, really repeating the words of the attorney. I don't know if there will be a material implication of this wording, but he did mention conspiracy. So that may have to kind of play into the intent part. But again, I'm not that of a legal professional on that front, so I won't comment. But yeah, that other crime wasn't made clear. They did mention wording about undermining, and I'm roughly quoting here, the integrity of the 2016 presidential election. It will yet have to be seen, I guess, about whether that would play into Mr. Cohen's guilty plea, where he pleaded guilty to violations of federal campaign laws. So that's, again, going back to the hook point, that it would have to be proven that Mr. Trump committed that falsification of business record with the sort of intention to commit or conceal that other crime, and that other crime could potentially be Mr. Cohen's federal campaign finance violations. But we don't know that at this point.
It seemed like from Alvin Bragg's statement that he made after the actual arraignment, that the line that the prosecution is going down is campaign finance violations. And let me ask you, in terms of getting a guilty plea here, or getting a guilty verdict, let's say if this trial actually goes to a jury, does the state have to actually prove that President Trump committed this other crime? Because it seems like it doesn't make sense to me. Because the way the statute is written is that, let's say in New York State, they find a drug dealer or some mafioso. He's selling drugs, and then he has bookkeeping fraud to conceal his selling of drugs. And so they charge him with bookkeeping fraud in order to conceal this other crime of selling drugs. However, if he is found innocent of the drug selling crime, then the bookkeeping crime doesn't even make sense, because there's no other crime that he's concealing. And so my question here is, because President Trump himself has not been found guilty of any type of election campaign finance violations for the 2016 election, how can he be charged with these false entries in business records to conceal the crime that he has not been charged for?
Right, and you bring up a very good question, and that was kind of my confusion too. During my report, when ever since Mr. former President Trump, he sort of declared on his own social media that he would be arrested. That I've been kind of paying attention to sort of the legal problems, and I spoke to like Alan Dershowitz. He's a prominent legal commentator and people like that. So I guess from my discussions with these legal scholars and experts, what there are kind of two questions that they've contended, and these are somewhat interrelated questions, right? So as you have brought up, that charge is a federal charge that what Mr. Alvin Bragg is trying to bring, right? And this it's falsification of business record, which is sort of the main driving charge in this indictment, is a state charge. So in some ways, whether Alvin Bragg has you can say jurisdiction, you can say, has the sort of cause to make that, federal crime to play into the state charge that he was bringing. That was a very contentious legal question. I'll drop some names like Alan Dershowitz. He thinks he calls this made up laws, right? He doesn't think. To me, he called it a made up laws. He doesn't think that this combination of law is appropriate because when teaching at Harvard Law School for 50 years, the number one rule, the very important rule that he thought was the criminal law is not supposed to be creative, and he used the words of Thomas Jefferson, and he said, a lay person should be able to read it, and I'm roughly quoting here, a lay person should be able to read it while running. That's how simple criminal law should be, right? And this creative lawmaking shouldn't be, that this combination, this mishmash of a state and federal law sort of thing. From people I talk to, it's unprecedented, and this shouldn't be, applied in the case. So that's the combination part. So that's the first question, right? And the second question is sort of related, is whether when the state legislature made those laws, right? Because the state legislature, when they made those laws, they said it was some other crime, but they didn't limit it to other state crimes. A trial attorney with several dozens of years experience, John Connor, like he's one of the people I talked to, he thinks that because this law was made under a sort of like a state setting, that other crime, as we've spoken about, should be limited to state violations. It should be limited state violations only. But there's another professor I spoke to. He's from a law school, and he thinks that the role of the courts is to interpret the intention behind the legislature lawmaking process, and it's to interpret from the text of the law. And if the text of the law doesn't interpret, and if the text law doesn't show intention that they will limit it to that state crime, then he says he also is obviously objecting to the other to the other side here. And he says this shouldn't a federal charge could in this case be possible. But yeah, most of us experts I talked to thinks this is not appropriate. It's not, as you said, this is unprecedented.
It's not. I mean, again, I'm just a lay person. I haven't touched a law book since I was in college, but it just seems like even from what you described, there would need to be a crime, right? At the end of the day, what you're describing is, okay, so this law, some professors that you interviewed, some law professors are saying that the bookkeeping charge would need to be concealing a state crime, for instance. But some are saying, well, it's okay if it's concealing a federal crime because the law can work either way. But it seems like there needs to be a crime to be concealed. And if the crime that he's being charged with is federal elections violations, federal elections fraud, that's a federal level crime that's under the purview of the Federal Elections Commission. Now, during Trump's presidency, I remember very famously William Barr made that determination that the DOJ is going to hold by their longstanding policy of not indicting or a sitting president. But then even later in 2021, when Trump was already out of office, the Federal Elections Commission again voted to not prosecute President Trump for this exact crime. So the relevant agency who is in charge of determining whether or not Trump was indeed in violation of this federal fraud statute decided that they're going to wash their hands of it. They're not going to prosecute him. And so, how can it still boggles my mind. I still just don't understand it. How can a Manhattan district attorney then put this case in front of a jury and say, hey, you have to decide whether Trump was cooking the books in order to conceal this federal crime? It almost seems like then, I mean, it just doesn't seem to work, because then you'd need to have a state jury and a state prosecutor essentially prosecuting something that's completely out of their jurisdiction. It's a federal crime. They would have to determine, hey, yes, Trump committed this federal crime, but then it's like, well, who are you to say that? Even if he did, that's my whole point. Because looking at these documents, I mean, to be frank, it's not exactly clear that his hands are clean, but it just seems like it would be hard and perhaps even impossible to prove in court, right? Because not only did the Federal Elections Commission say that, we're not going to prosecute him, but you can also make the obvious argument that, hey, you know what, I paid this money just because I didn't want, to hurt my relationship with my wife, Melania, for instance. He can make that argument. This wasn't about the election. This is about my personal image, about my wife. And so I mean, how does that work? Did you speak to any professor or any legal, lawyer or legal scholar who thinks that this makes sense? And if it doesn't make sense, how could the Manhattan DA have brought it up if there's no way to win in court?
Two-part question. This is something unprecedented from the, I guess, the knowledge base of the people who I spoke to who taught law for, dozens of years. As regards to whether this makes sense from a legal perspective, most people, the vast majority, maybe let's say except for one, the vast majority of people I spoke to is, says no. The question, that's a clear no. It's like it doesn't make sense this way, and I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was asking what did the one person who said that it does make sense? What did they say?
They basically said, well, they said there's a reasonable argument to the side that it would make sense. They said, although this is unprecedented, we are already in unprecedented territory. We've never been prosecuted. We've never have been prosecuted for a president before. But that aside, they said the rule of the courts is to interpret the intention of it. It goes back to the point that I was talking about. It's to interpret the intention of the legislature, right, and what they intended, and then based on the plain language of the text itself, that doesn't preclude a federal, the bootstrapping of federal crime. Now that's a separate question from what we talk about, because you mentioned a very important point, because you need to be able to link this. If we were to hand out the indictment, if a grand jury were able to hand out the indictment, as they did last Thursday, they need to define probable cause on that entire chain of crime that we spoke about. They need to define probable cause. They need to say, I found it that the evidence speaks that there is a probable cause that President Trump falsified a business record with the intent to conceal or commit another crime. And this standard, I can't answer whether this standard apply. There's two parts here. There's the original crime, crime A, falsification of the business record, crime B, the other crime, right? So does this probable cause standard applies to both? Does the crime B, the federal crime that we're speaking about, where that we're kind of speculating about, does this need to be a convicted crime, or can we just say we find probable cause that crime has been committed, right? So at that point, most of the professors that I spoke to, or the people who I spoke to, kind of lean in your kind of thinking about that is that we need to find a crime, right? There has to be another crime that they have committed, right, in order to support that state crime. Not mentioning we haven't found such a crime. Alvin Bragg's state level jurisdiction is here, right, and the federal agency's jurisdiction is here. Let's say the FEC or the institutions that were searching President Trump. Alvin Bragg, from the people who I spoke to, they're saying he's trying to stretch the law so that he can almost sort of like overcome he can sort of overcome that whatever findings that they have, and stretch law to sort of try to bring a charge then this is tertiary words based on made up laws, based on sort of made up crimes, right?
Clear, you can run, you can jog and understand the law. What you basically said, Gary, is like, if I accuse you of selling meth and also cooking the books to conceal your selling of meth, it would be basically me saying like, hey, you're selling meth. I don't need to prove that you're selling meth, but I'll prove that you're cooking the books to hide the fact that you're selling meth, and that's enough to convict you, even though I haven't proven whether or not you're selling meth. That's a rudimentary example, but that's sort of how I'm starting to see it. Gary, thank you so much for your insight, and get some sleep. You've been up since 2 a.m.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Great to be here.
Yeah. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we're about 31 minutes into the stream. We're gonna hop on over to Epic TV. Earlier today, we were over in a park in downtown Manhattan covering the pro-Trump. Actually, it was interesting. It was the park was split in half by the police, and it was a pro-Trump rally on one side and sort of an anti-Trump demonstration on the other side. And we were there for 6 hours speaking with people and getting their testimony and asking them why they're there. And so we're going to speak to a few more Epic Times reporters, get their takes on it, get their expertise, and then we'll show you some of that footage. And the reason that we'll hop on over to Epic TV is because YouTube is the most censorious environment, well, maybe next to TikTok. In fact, our sister media, NTD, they have a program called The Nation Speaks. And on that program, they had a segment where they showed a Trump rally, just a Trump rally. They were interviewing people. They were showing the banners. They showed the speech, and they got kicked off of YouTube. They got a strike and for a severe policy violation, and they were barred from that video. Got deleted. They got a strike, and they're not able to publish for 7 days. And of course, if they get 2 more strikes within a certain period of time, they're going to be their channel is going to be completely kicked off. But really think about that. Trump right now is the front runner in the Republican primary. He is the contender for the president's office in 2024. And yet, if you just cover his rally, if you're just there with the camera walking around asking people, hey, why are you here, blah, 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 you're going to get kicked off the platform. So that's the kind of situation we're living in. And obviously, some of the people we spoke to at the pro-Trump rally in downtown Manhattan said some things that on YouTube wouldn't necessarily be what they call YouTube advertiser friendly. And so we'll hop over to Epic TV. If you want to check it, if you want to join us, the link will be there in the description box below. And let's make the jump. See you there.